We're kind of at the end of this journey through the Sermon on the Mount. This wonderful teaching of Jesus, very condensed, but it's all there. And we kind of come full circle. We started with this parable of two builders, and we're back where we began. One foolish builder, one wise builder. Jesus's question kind of hangs in the air to each of us. How will you build your life? How will you build faith in your life? Are we going to listen to the words that Jesus has given us in this sermon, this advice, this guidance, this deep spirituality about how to travel well? Are we going to take them to heart? Are we going to build wisely, or are we just going to discount them and build according to our own ways? Might we even recognize from some of the things we've discovered in this sermon, might we just see there's some stuff in our life that's got to go. There's some demolition to do so that we can build properly. Have we been convicted of any stuff that's going on in there? So we're getting to the end. This is kind of a conclusion that wraps up what Jesus has been saying, and he kind of wants to get our attention. There's a couple of warnings in there about some choices that we have, and then he'll end with this parable. So I'm going to ask David to come up and bring our reading for us. So Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 to 29, and David will read that for us. Thank you, David.
Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.
Thank you, David. That was great. So here we are then. Jesus has presented this radical principles of kingdom and kingdom living. And at the end of all of this, we're told the crowd are astonished, actually. They're astonished. He teaches with authority. There's something about the way he delivers this stuff that goes beyond anything they've ever heard before. The word become flesh brings the words of eternal life. Pay attention, listen to these words. Is kind of what Matthew was getting at in his writing here in his gospel. And Jesus concludes with this lovely illustration, and we saw Luke's interpretation there of it up on the screen. These two builders. But before he gets this parable, he warns his listeners. He's got a couple of things to say about choices that we've got in life. He's kind of saying something like, you've heard my teaching now, you've listened to my teaching, but be aware that there are going to be some hazards along the way. Take care not to lose your way or be led astray from your way. And specifically, he mentions three things for us to look out for. Three choices that we have actually along the way. There's a choice between the way we go, a choice between two gates or two roads. Which way will we go? There are choices between people to listen to, describes them as prophets, people who suggest that they're sharing something from God to us. Two messages purporting to be from God. Some are right, some are wrong. Be careful who we listen to. And there are apparently two sorts of disciples, two sorts of followers. Some who say they're followers and some who are followers. So let's look into these just a little bit more deeply, if you like. So first one then, verses 13 and 14, the narrow and the wide gates. So Julie and I are enjoying Derbyshire. We're enjoying the countryside round here and all the rest of it, walking the edges and the Peak District. But I've got a question to you Derbyshire folk about your dry stone walls, actually. Okay, because what's wrong with stiles? What is wrong with normal stiles? Instead, you've got these dry stone walls, and then you've got these narrow gaps with two posts at a slight angle and all the rest of it. And so I'm coming along to these narrow gaps in these walls to pass through and follow the path, and I've got my rucksack on my back, and you take the first step and put your leg through the gap, and then you're wedged. Does my bum look big in this style? I'm stuck between these two posts, and then the rucksack is in the way. And so Julie thinks this is a hoot because I have to take the rucksack off and pass that over and then kind of get myself through this gap. And we carry on. It's kind of the narrow way. And I try and negotiate these things as best I can. Have I got too much stuff that I'm carrying or on my back? Maybe. And it's a bit like when you go to the airport, for those of you who fly frequently and all the rest of it, and you go to the Ryanair check-in. Have you done the Ryanair check-in? Yeah, they don't understand the principle of hand luggage, do they, at all? They pretty much charge you for everything that you're carrying other than the bare minimum. Or maybe it's a bit like the wagon driver who's driving along very, very happily, and he comes to the bridge and has a problem when he tries to drive under because the load on the back is too high and jams under the bridge. Or maybe it's a bit like another parable that Jesus tells in Luke 18, verse 25, about the struggle of getting a rich man into the kingdom of heaven, being a bit like trying to get a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. The narrow way and the wide way. How much stuff are we trying to take with us? How much stuff that actually slows us down, gets in the way, comes between, wedges us in the gates? The narrow way, the wide way, the things that we cling to and rely on and try to take with us, things that rank ahead of, depending on the love and mercy of God, the stuff that gets in the way. That's what Jesus is getting at here, the stuff that gets in the way. And I've noticed out there when you go up in the Peak District and go exploring and all the rest of it, I've noticed that when you're following these paths, there is often a really broad track, path, whatever that you can go down, the broad way. It's the way that's well traveled. The crowds are always going down there. If you go down the summer, there's big groups and all the rest of it, hordes of people going down the wide way, the broad way. It's the popular way. It's the crowd's way. It's the easy way to find. There's no need for a guide. It's clear which way you're going. Just follow the track, follow the masses, follow the crowds. It'll lead somewhere. But it's so often the narrow way, the fainter, lightly trod path that actually is far more rewarding. It rewards us with undiscovered wonders. You can find the hidden waterfall. You can find the pretty meadow. You can find the shy wildlife. But that track, that fainter track, that's the route where maybe we need a map, where maybe we need to pause a bit more often and think where it's going, or maybe we need a guide to refer to regularly. It's slower because we have to stop and consult and check in with the guide or the map that we're following. And I think that is exactly what Jesus is getting at. Sometimes we're so preoccupied with the destination, getting there, that we don't enjoy the journey with him and talk with him and consult with him. He wants us to travel with him, to ask him, to walk with him, to invite him to guide us, to travel together, to spend time with him, to enjoy the journey with him, to slow down and take in the view that he wants to show us along the way. Let me show you this. Let me show you that. Did you realize this? Did you know that together? It's the walking with Jesus way of life. It leads to life, and it is life, because he is the way, the truth, and the life, how we travel. It's intentional following, and it's the opposite of the quick fix, let's get there as soon as we can. It's slowing down. And then there's the second choice, if you like, that Jesus points out. This one about true and false prophets. Who do we listen to? Who do we trust? Verses 15 to 20. How to recognize the true leaders, I guess. How to identify who we listen to from the false ones. And he says very, very simply, he says it's by their fruit. By their fruits, look at what they're producing. And it's a bit like a fake Rolex watch or rip-off copies of Gucci handbags or whatever. We have to kind of look beyond the surface, beyond the superficial. It looks right on the outside, looks okay, got the logo, got all the right words, the colors and all the rest of it, looks okay on the outside. But over time, doesn't feel quite right. Doesn't sit particularly well. And over time, the fakes will reveal something. They'll reveal a lack of depth or lack of quality. And you begin to realize there's something not right with this. It's pretending to be, but there's something not quite right. There's a lack of quality. They're simply not the real thing inside. It's a bit like the outward appearance of piety, but underneath, the there's a question about the inner reality of the faith. At first glance, they look similar, but the long-term fruitfulness distinguishes the real from the fake. Because there are some very, very basic principles in life. There are. Grapes come from vines. Thorns grow on thorn bushes. Good trees bear good fruit. Bad trees bear bad fruit. End of. Simple rule. Simple rule. On the way down to Pembrokeshire, Julie and I go down there most years in the summer. We like it down there. And as you travel down that coast road of West Wales, and you're getting further south, coming towards Cardigan round there's a little town called Aberaeron, beautiful, pretty little place, Aberaeron. And if you go inland from Aberaeron, there's a National Trust house there, and a bit of an estate called Llanachairon. And it's lovely. And Julie and I have been visiting there for years. We went there to have a look at it, just as it had been handed over to the National Trust, and it was in a right state. But it was amazing, some of the stuff that we saw there. It was all very run down and dilapidated, and it had got some wall gardens at the back that had been just not looked after for many, many years. And in the wall gardens there are 2 orchards, and the orchards had gone wild. They're full of ancient apple and pear trees, and they're still there. They've trimmed them back a bit, but they've kept them going. And if you look at these trees, these apple trees and these pear trees, they are ancient. Some of them are leaning this way and that. They're covered in moss and lichen. They don't look overly pretty, actually. And yet, they have an inner health about them. They have an inner health about them. And you can tell that because every autumn, the harvest, the fruit is vast. Tons and tons of apples. The National Trust don't know what to do with them, that many. Fruitfulness. And the fruitfulness is the reality that can't be argued with. These trees are okay. There's no need to dig them up or anything like that. They're doing what healthy apple trees do. There are seasons. There are seasons to plant, an investment, a time to plant, to nurture, and to grow. There are seasons of preparation to ensure seasons of fruitfulness. Know what to look for in who you listen to and who you follow. That's what Jesus is saying. Know how to test those who try to share a word from God with you. Weigh it. You've got choices who you listen to and who you follow. So if I've got an empty church next week, I'll know what you think. Okay? So there we go. And thirdly, another choice Jesus says, and he's talking about disciples, true and false disciples, followers, in verses 21 to 23. Us, or people like us. And hypocrisy has been a theme that's cropped up in this sermon regularly, actually, in this Sermon on the Mount. This pretending to be something or someone, this wearing of a mask. And it crops up here again. And this is something, it's a bit of a 21st century thing, actually, that we have to be aware of. And they call it performance religion. Performance religion. It's a temptation for us all, isn't it? We've come to church. Therefore, when I come to church, I put on this, whatever it is you put on, the face, the clothes, the performance, and whatever. It's a temptation, isn't it? Yeah? Because that's what you do in church. That's what we do. It's what we've always done. Performance religion is something each of us has to just think about. It's ritual rather than intentional faith. Security, where does it come from? Some people come to get their fix of religious exuberance, whatever it is. Oh, I feel better for that. Had a good sing, had a good clap, had a good shout out. And yet there's no personal change, no encounter, no transformation, no letting of God in. It's been more about getting something out. Gerard Kelly says this, kind of a paraphrase of what Jesus is saying up front here. It's kind of saying there's a cost to discipleship, a cost to following. Don't claim me as your Lord unless you're prepared to embark on an adventure of change. Don't just say my name because it's the clubby thing to do. I'm not a flavor of the month religious icon. Take me on as a partner in your life, a partner who wants to travel with you on a deep journey of faith and change you, letting God in. And Jesus is kind of saying there that there are some people who say the words, say the right things, seem to do the right things. It even looks as though God is blessing some of the things they're doing. But it's about this change inside, discovering and doing the will of God. The true test of righteousness doesn't necessarily lie in the miracles or apparent miracles that seem to go on as a result of what people say and do and maybe even pray. God knows what's going on inside. Be aware of that. He does. Jesus and his name are not simply to be used for purposes other than serving him, serving his kingdom. It is possible to get caught up in the religious club and not actually have had that transformation inside. Let him in. Let him in. And so, having given us those three choices, then Jesus comes to this parable, a fourth choice, basically. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who's built his house on the rock. The rain comes down, streams rise, winds blow, beat against the house, and yet it doesn't fall down because it's founded on a rock. But anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, streams rose, winds blew, beat against that house, and it fell with a crash. And the crowds are amazed. He's warning folks, if you're going to listen to me, if you're going to follow me, then take it seriously. Take it seriously. It's not always going to be easy. How are you going to build is the question he's asking. Are you going to botch it? Botch it? Or are you going to build well? It's a choice. It's a choice. So this invitation from Jesus has been heard by men and women from all walks of life throughout history for centuries and for centuries. And at different times in history, amazing things have happened through people who have given themselves to the Lord. Some of it has been recorded for posterity. Other stuff has gone on. I'm sure when we get to glory and we meet people up in heaven there, we'll say, who are you? What did you do? And we'll discover amazing ministries that have never been recorded for our benefit, just to read the book about it. But along the way, there's one or two folks who have. And here's one story. And this is about a young man. A couple of books are written about him. And I've got one or two here. By a guy called Benedict. And this happened way, way back when, in the early 6th century. What might God do in the 21st century with your life? Way back in the 6th century, a young guy called Benedict traveled from a small central Italian town called Nursia, and he was sent to Rome by his parents as part of his education. So off he goes, young man. 50 years before that, Rome had been sacked by the barbarians, and the great center of Christianity and the church had fallen from its greatness. Rome was a mess, and really, the church was having its struggles there at head office in Rome as well. Benedict, when he arrived in Rome, was shocked. He was shocked by the vice and corruption of Rome. And so this young man retreated, left the city, went up into the Cimbrunian hills, and then just after that moved to live in a cave in the rocks, not far from where Nero's palace had been, 40 miles east of Rome. And he stayed there, stayed in this cave for 3 years, lived there, alone, talking to God. His food and some very basic necessities were provided, delivered to him by a monk from a nearby monastery. And after 3 years, by the time Benedict emerged from the cave, he'd developed a reputation for holiness and for nearness to Jesus. And this reputation had spread, and he was invited to be abbot of a nearby monastic community. What about that? That happened to one of you, 3 years solitary, and then you get invited because suddenly you've been transformed. God has changed you. And people recognize it. So off he goes to guide the monks. This young guy, bear in mind, he was a bright young man, but he'd been alone in a cave 3 years with God. What do I do now, God? What do I do? So Benedict wrote a very, very simple book of guidance, and later on that became known as the Rule of St. Benedict. And what Benedict described as this school for the Lord's service, it was made up of 3 very, very simple vows or rules: obedience, commitment, and change or conversion of life, walking with Jesus. And this renewal of devotion and faith that Benedict started off in this cave up in the mountains there, led to the growth of monasteries in that region and then throughout Europe and so on, as hundreds and then thousands of people devoted themselves to serve Jesus. And you'll see even in this country there are ruins of Benedictine abbeys and so on. It was a big movement of God in that time that came through one young man who decided to choose the narrow way and dump the rubbish, and went through the narrow gate and just gave himself completely. 3 years of stillness and quiet, listening, learning how to hear, and then out he came. And people recognized that holiness, that change in him. These communities that he set up became centers of restoration and learning and faith. They evangelized the barbarians that had sacked and destroyed Rome. They taught them about Jesus and how to pray and faith and how to live constructive rather than destructive lives and so on. All this from the seed of faith and devotion in one man, choosing to draw close to Jesus. Benedict had no intention of doing this. He didn't know where it would go. It wasn't his plan. He just drew close and followed where God led him. Kind of a revival, really, at that time. He wanted to devote himself to Jesus. What does God want to do in Chesterfield? What does he want to do? He hasn't given up, has he? I don't think he has. I don't think he has. And that's the challenge for us, to play our part and to follow closely. How will you build? How will you build? Let's be still. Jesus, I want to thank you for this remarkable teaching that Matthew has recorded for us. I want to thank you for the gospel writers and for each of us. Here this morning, we've listened to your words. We've heard again this very simple parable, this very simple story of choice as to how we build our lives. We get very caught up in the physical, practical stuff of life, and it is stuff. But this morning, we want to just open ourselves to what you're saying to us about how we travel, the way we're traveling. We want to build well on your words, because your words are life-giving and your way is life and leads to life. Holy Spirit, move among us. Help us to hear what you're convicting us of in our lives and our hearts in this day. We want to draw close, Jesus. Take our hand and draw us close now. For your glory, Lord. Amen.